There was once a man they called the Napoleon of Africa, but to those who survived an encounter with him, he was no king, no genius, but a nightmare wearing the mask of a man. His name was Shaka Zulu, a warrior of extraordinary skill, yet also the one who spread blood and fire across the lands of southern Africa, leaving behind fields of death and tribes erased from the map. And the question we must ask ourselves today as we look back through the eyes of survivors is, was Shaka truly a military genius, a great empire builder, or simply a demon disguised as a man? This is not merely the story of one individual. It is the story of an empire built upon blood of a tribe once small that rose to power under the iron will of a single man, and of the terrible price of greatness, a price paid in tens of thousands of lives. So let us step into the world of Shaka Zulu. And as we turn the pages of this blood-stained history, ask yourself, can true greatness ever exist without cruelty? Or are power and brutality forever bound together, two sides of the same coin? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and join me as we journey into the lives of those who changed history and uncover the secrets your school books never dared to tell. In the pages of early 19th century African history, the stories we often hear are of battles of kings, of men who turned deserts and savannas into kingdoms. But to understand Shaka, we must begin somewhere far smaller, in a dusty village where a child was not born as a blessing but as a stain. Shaka's father was Senzanga Hona, a Zulu prince. His mother Nandi was a princess of the neighbouring Langeni clan. On paper, it should have been a prestigious union, but to those who lived at the time, it was seen as love in the wrong place at the wrong moment. When Nandi became pregnant, whispers of scandal spread from village to village. People did not see affection, they saw disgrace. And so when Shaka was born, there were no feasts or celebrations, only scornful eyes and murmurs that this was a child no one had wanted. His entire childhood was marked by rejection. Nandi, proud and strong by nature, was forced to bow her head under constant mockery. She was called a disgrace, and her son became living proof of her humiliation. In a society where lineage and honor were everything, Shaka grew up as an outcast within his own bloodline. Other children could proudly invoke their father's names, but Shaka learned silence because his father's name brought not respect but ridicule. The early years of his life were a long chain of invisible wounds. Children taunted him for his birth, calling him a bastard, pushing him aside, excluding him. Even the elders of the village made no effort to hide their contempt. Where other children learned through encouragement, Shaka learned through scolding. Where others were cradled in family warmth, he grew up with wary eyes, knowing that anyone could turn into an enemy. Yet adversity did not break him. It forged him in brutal fashion. Shaka learned to swallow humiliation, to remain silent under insult. But within that silence, in his dark eyes, a flame was rising. He did not dream of acceptance, nor hope for rescue. He dreamed of the day when all who mocked him would bow their heads and finally acknowledge the strength they had once denied. In hardship, Nandi gave him a lesson. No school could teach the world will show you no mercy, so you must not show mercy to yourself. She had little to offer him but pride, and even though it was trampled, that pride seeped into his blood. From her, Shaka inherited harshness, a cold gaze toward life, and the conviction that power was the only true path to survival. While other children played freely on the grasslands, Shaka trained his body in silence. While they laughed around the fire, he sat alone, staring into the dark. He spoke little, but every word carried weight. People said he was a strange child, and they were right. Yet his strangeness was not just difference, it was a sign. A sign of the man who would one day reshape the destiny of the Zulu people, though at a cost paid in blood and tears. From the outside, his childhood may look like nothing more than the story of a neglected boy. But beneath the surface, it was the crucible in which his soul was sharpened. His heart hardened into stone, and his hatred grew heavier by the day. Where others crumbled under scorn, Shaka turned it into fuel. His solitude was not emptiness, but the foundation for an immense ambition to make himself the strongest, so that he would never again be looked down upon. Like iron heated red-hot and plunged into cold water, Shaka's shame-filled youth tempered him into someone both unyielding and dangerous. And when the time came, the boy once despised by his village would emerge from the shadows carrying years of pent-up fury to begin his journey as a warrior, and ultimately as the bringer of terror across a vast land. As Shaka's childhood slipped away in bitterness and shadow, the world around him was also stirring with restless currents. The tribes of southeastern Africa did not live in peace, but clashed again and again, fighting to defend their lands, to expand them, and to prove their strength. In this endless cycle, young men usually faced two paths to live, as farmers bent over fields and herding cattle, or to join the ranks of warriors, where spears and blood would decide their fate. For Shaka, the choice was almost inevitable. A child once scorned would never accept a quiet, ordinary life. His chance came when he entered the army of the Mthethwa, serving under their leader Dingiswayo. For Shaka, this was not merely a step out of his village, but a step out of the long shadow of his past. Dingiswayo was no reckless warmonger. He was a shrewd and far-sighted leader, and under his command Shaka encountered for the first time the true meaning of discipline. Here the boy who had once been cast aside finally felt he belonged. In the army no one cared that he was born out of wedlock, no one remembered the insults that had scarred his childhood. A man's worth was measured only by his strength, his agility, and his ability to survive on the battlefield. With his powerful body and iron will, Shaka soon stood out. He was not just strong, but strikingly different in the way he thought. During drills, Shaka went further than the others. He didn't simply throw the spear as ordered, he observed, analyzed, studied the way formations moved, and how they fell apart in chaos. He noticed weaknesses others ignored. While his comrades treated battle like a ritual of honor, Shaka saw it as a game of strategy, where each move could mean life or death. Dingiswayo noticed him. He saw not only courage in the young warrior, but also cunning. And so Shaka was given the chance to command small units. Under his leadership, men no longer fought as reckless individuals but moved together like a machine. Shaka taught them silence before striking discipline in every step, and most importantly, he instilled in them the belief that war was not for boasting but for annihilation. Shaka's first battles with the Mthethwa carved his name into memory. He charged with a cold gaze, his spear thrusts sharp and decisive. But what astonished people was not just how he killed, but how he directed others to kill. Warriors under Shaka felt the difference within his ranks. No one acted alone. All were part of a single, unbreakable force. It was also during this time that Shaka learned an essential truth. Individual strength was never enough. A warrior, no matter how skilled, could be crushed in the chaos without order. From his days as a soldier under the Mthethwa, he began to nurture a greater vision, a dream of an army, unlike any other one that would not merely hurl spears and shout war cries, but crush enemies through iron discipline and overwhelming tactics. The years with the Mthethwa were Shaka's true schooling, though it was no gentle education. It was a school of blood and sweat. He entered as an outcast, and with each passing day proved himself a formidable warrior. It was here that he discovered war was no game, that survival demanded more than brute strength. It required thought, absolute control, and a discipline so harsh it could feel merciless. In that forge of steel, something new began to take shape. Shaka was no longer the abandoned child, no longer the boy who nursed his wounds in silence. He had become a warrior, and more than that, a commander. But this was only the beginning. While others were content with the fame of battle, Shaka's eyes looked further. He began to question, to doubt, to realize that if he truly wanted to change his destiny, he could not simply follow what was taught. He would have to break every mold and create a new way of war. In the Mthethwa army, Shaka learned discipline. He learned how to command, and he understood that war was not merely a display of strength. Yet one thing always unsettled him. He would watch the ranks of warriors thunder forward, hear the cries echoing across the battlefield, see the long spears slicing through the air, and then almost instantly it was all over. Battles ended quickly. The defeated scattered the victors, shouted in triumph, but rarely was there complete destruction. To Shaka, this was not war. It was ritual performance, a waste of power. He saw weakness even in the weapons. The Zulu, like many other tribes, still used long, slender spears good for throwing from a distance. But Shaka realized that these spears were little better than crude arrows, inflicting wounds, but seldom killing outright. And once the spears had been hurled, the warriors were left with nothing but their shields exposed and vulnerable. He began to despise the weapon, seeing it as a symbol of half-hearted war. The formations too frustrated him. Warriors charged in chaos with no tight coordination. The strong dashed to the front, the weaker drifted to the sides, and battles devolved into spontaneous clashes where each man fought for himself rather than for the whole. To Shaka, this was wasteful, a squandered chance to transform war into a true art of domination. From these observations, he began to imagine a different way of fighting. In his mind, a principle emerged, harsh but logical. War should not end when the enemy fled. It should end when the enemy ceased to exist. Only total annihilation could guarantee that no one would return to seek revenge. It was an idea that ran against tradition, for among the tribes, war was usually about displaying strength, seizing cattle, or claiming land, rarely about exterminating the foe. Shaka chose the opposite path, and in that defiance he defined himself. He started testing his ideas on a small scale. Instead of the long spear, he crafted a shorter, sturdier weapon with a broad blade perfect for driving into an enemy's chest at close range. This spear would later be known as the exile, named after the wet, sucking sound it made when pulled from a victim's body. Shaka cherished that sound. To him, it was proof of a true victory. In training, he forced his warriors to fight up close, to use their shields, not just for defense, but as weapons, pushing, pressing, unbalancing their foes before striking the fatal blow with the exile. He saw this as the art of killing at close quarters, brutally efficient, a source of terror no enemy could withstand. At first, many warriors resisted. They preferred throwing spears from afar, where it was safer, less demanding of courage. But Shaka drove them to exhaustion, forcing them to embrace the brutality of each thrust, until fear itself hardened into instinct. It was not only weapons that he sought to change, but organization itself. He envisioned an army not as a collection of individuals, but as a living body, each unit moving like limbs, each formation working like joints. For him, war was no longer chaos but calculated movement, where every advance drove the enemy step by step toward inevitable death. Even in those early days, under Dingiswayo, Shaka was already stepping beyond the role of a warrior. He became in his own way a dreamer, dreaming of a perfect army, dreaming of battles not simply won but crushing, erasing enemies from existence. Yet this dream was no illusion. It was rooted in careful observation, in a mind both analytical and filled with bitterness. And that fusion of cold calculation and burning hatred laid the foundation for everything he would later achieve. While others settled for fleeting glory, Shaka prepared in silence for a revolution in the art of war. One day he would no longer be just a warrior under another's banner, but the man who redefined how the Zulu held their spears and marched into battle. And when that day came, all of southern Africa would know Shaka not merely as a fighter, but as the creator of a deadly dance where step shield and blade fused into a nightmare. In African history, few figures have left a mark on the art of war as profoundly as Shaka Zulu, and at the heart of his legacy lies a revolution in both weaponry and military discipline. Before Shaka Zulu, warriors typically relied on long-throwing spears meant more for keeping distance than for decisive combat. Battles were often little more than displays of bravado. Warriors hurled a few spears, shouted, then withdrew, more ritual than real slaughter. But Shaka, shaped by his own hard-won experience on the battlefield, recognized the futility of this approach. He envisioned a weapon that forced men to face their enemy up close, a tool that would transform war from a performance into a fight for survival. That weapon was the exile, a short spear with a wide, heavy blade and a sturdy wooden shaft, designed for stabbing rather than throwing. Its name came from the chilling sound it made when pulled from an enemy's body. Gruesome, yes, but to Shaka, it was more than a killing tool. It was a symbol of a new age of warfare, one in which the Zulu no longer fought to intimidate but to annihilate. Weapons, however, were only half the revolution. The other half was discipline. Shaka believed that true strength lay not in numbers but in forging soldiers as unyielding as iron. He demanded daily training, forcing his warriors to run long distances beneath the blazing sun barefoot until their feet grew as tough as stone. To him, any man who could not run 10 miles without gasping for breath had no right to carry a spear into battle. The regimen was brutal, so much so that many recruits died during training. But Shaka saw their deaths as necessary sacrifices in the forging of an army. In Shaka's ranks, weakness had no place. He outlawed the wearing of traditional leather sandals, declaring them a crutch that softened the feet. His rules on loyalty and courage were merciless. Any man who fled from battle was executed sometimes by the very comrades who had fought beside him. Fear became a weapon, but so too did an iron discipline that bound the warriors together with a unity rare among the region's tribes. Shaka also reorganized the Zulu into regiments called impi, each numbering several thousand men tightly commanded and given specific missions. These units were fast, flexible, and capable of covering vast distances without exhaustion, thanks to the punishing drills that had hardened them beforehand. What once were scattered tribal fighters were now reshaped into a killing machine, a force that moved with purpose and precision. But Shaka's genius lay not only in his reforms of weapons and training, it was in the way he fused them into a system. With the exile iron discipline and the structure of the empire, he redefined what war meant. No longer could his enemies treat combat as ritual. Under Shaka, war became a struggle for existence itself. One either destroyed the enemy or was destroyed. Tribes that had once dismissed the Zulu as insignificant now trembled at their very name, for to speak of Shaka was to summon fear. And this system, this blending of weapon, discipline and organization, laid the groundwork for Shaka's next and most famous creation, the legendary bullhorn formation. With it, the Zulu would rise from a minor tribe to a military power that shook the entire continent of Africa. There's something strange about history. The greatest strategies often wear familiar shapes. Alexander the Great forged his phalanx into a moving wall of steel. Hannibal Barca unleashed war elephants and crushed Rome at Cannae, and Shaka Zulu, the abandoned son who rose from nothing, found his model not in the eagle above or the lion of the savannah, but in the African buffalo, a beast massive and unyielding with horns that curve like blades. From that vision the buffalo horns were born. Before Shaka, the Zulu fought much like their neighbors in southern Africa. Two sides would gather, approach cautiously, and hurl spears at one another. Battles rarely ended in total bloodshed. More often than not, one side simply broke and ran. It was ritual, a test of honor rather than a furnace of annihilation. But for Shaka, this was weakness, wasteful and unworthy of his ambition. He did not want to defeat, he wanted to destroy. A battle that allowed enemies to slip away was no battle at all. He craved a formation from which no one could escape alive. So he looked to the buffalo. When they attacked, they did not charge blindly. They formed a crescent. The leaders at the front drove straight into the foe, locking them in place, while the flanks curved inward, slowly tightening the noose. The result was a living vice, crushing everything caught inside. Shaka, with the ruthless brilliance carved into him since childhood, seized upon that vision and turned it into a doctrine of war. He called it the buffalo horns. In this formation, the Zulu army was split into three distinct parts. At the center stood the chest, the seasoned warriors tasked with striking head-on, pinning the enemy in a brutal embrace, forcing them to fight where they stood. The horns, nimble and swift, swept wide on both sides, curling in until the retreat was cut off like shears closing on cloth. Behind them waited the reserves, the loins, usually younger men untested, ready to reinforce when the front tired or to surge forward for the final killing stroke. From above, the formation resembled a trap open at first, then slowly closing. By the time an enemy realized the jaws were snapping shut, it was already too late. No escape, no mercy, only the flash of the short stabbing spear. The Ikalwa, catching the sunlight, and the thunder of Zulu war cries rolling across the field. What made this strategy truly lethal was not just its shape, but the new discipline and weapons Shaka had imposed upon his warriors. Imagine it, young men once content to throw spears from a distance, now forced to march barefoot for miles until their feet hardened, like stone drilled endlessly in close combat, until the thrust of the Ikalwa into an enemy's chest became second nature. They ceased being hunters playing at ritual war. They became professional soldiers, obedient, relentless, waiting for the signal to swing wide and drive their blades into backs. Some historians have compared Shaka's buffalo horns to Hannibal's encirclement at Cannae in 216 BC, where Carthage annihilated a Roman army. The parallel is striking. Yet Shaka's genius lay in doing the same without elephants, without cavalry. His tools were only men discipline and the imagination of a boy once abandoned, watching buffalo move across the plains. And that is why his tactic bears such a distinct African signature: simple, brutal, devastating. They say that when the Zulu first unleashed the horns in battle, their enemies were bewildered. At first it seemed like nothing more than a reckless charge, until the flanks began to swing shut. Then panic spread. Warriors who tried to flee realized there was no way out. The trap was sealed. It was not a battle, but an extermination. For Shaka, extermination was the goal. From that moment, the name of the Zulu spread like fire through dry grass. Neighboring tribes trembled not only at the carnage, but at the certainty of defeat. The buffalo horns allowed no second chances, no survivors to tell tales of escape. Once the jaws closed, all that remained was blood and shattered bone beneath the bare feet of the Zulu. Yet the terror of the buffalo horns was not only in its victories, but in what it declared. Where others fought to prove honor, Shaka declared that war was not ritual, it was empire. He fought not to show courage, but to expand territory, to cement absolute power, to transform the Zulu from a small clan into a force that made all of southern Africa shudder. The buffalo horns were the spear he thrust into history, the weapon that turned his vision into reality. Today, when people speak the name Shaka Zulu, they imagine bare-chested warriors, Ikalwa spears, flashing feet pounding the earth in unison, moving as one to the command of a man who carried both genius and ruthlessness in equal measure. It is more than an image of a leader, it is proof of how the human mind, taking its cues from nature, can craft the deadliest of weapons, discipline, and strategy. And so, from abandonment, from a childhood steeped in bitterness and vengeance, Shaka forged the buffalo horns, a formation that shook Africa to its core, and carved his name forever into the chronicles of war as both a military genius and a Forblier-Malt, bringer of merciless death. When a dynasty falters, history often hands the stage to someone ruthless enough, ambitious enough to seize it. The death of Dingiswayo, the Mthethwa leader who once sheltered and shaped Shaka, was exactly that turning point. In the chaos of power, Shaka, no longer just a remarkable warrior, but now a seasoned military commander, saw the void destiny had left behind. He understood that this was more than a contest for a throne. It was a chance to finally escape the shadow of an abandoned childhood. Unlike others who leaned only on bloodlines to claim authority, Shaka entered the game with a sword dripping in blood. He had carved his reputation on the battlefield, in victories that echoed across tribes. That gave him a terrifying advantage: the loyalty of his soldiers. They did not follow Shaka because of his parentage, but because they had seen him turn ordinary men into unstoppable killing machines. And when Dingiswayo was gone, that army became the foundation from which Shaka could challenge anyone who stood in his way. The takeover was never smooth, because power is never a gift freely handed. Several tribal leaders resisted him, seeing Shaka as an outsider, an ambitious warrior, unworthy of rule. But Shaka grasped one simple truth: victory silences all opposition. He crushed each rival with merciless brutality, but also with a rare kind of cunning. Tribes too weak to resist were met with the hand of diplomacy, promised protection and spoils if they submitted. Those who dared defy him were annihilated without hesitation, their corpses left as warnings louder than any proclamation. From this sea of blood and fire, Shaka rose like a towering volcano, proclaiming himself king of the Zulu. At that time, the Zulu were still a small clan among countless groups scattered across southeastern Africa. But under his rule, they began transforming into a political and military force with ambitions far greater than their humble origins. What made Shaka truly fearsome was not only his military strength, but his ability to wield fear as a weapon. He knew that to rule was not just to inspire respect, but to carve terror into the hearts of others. Rebels were executed publicly, often in ways that seared unforgettable images into the minds of those who watched. At the same time, he rewarded loyalty, lavishly turning survivors into allies who learned quickly that in his world the choice was obedience or death. Shaka was not a mere tribal chief in the old sense. He acted as a nation builder. He restructured the Zulu community, fusing scattered clans into a single entity under absolute power. Political marriages were arranged bloodlines interwoven to reinforce legitimacy. In solemn rituals, Shaka stood tall before the crowds, no longer the abandoned child of his youth, but the embodiment of power itself, a living symbol no one could deny. With his rise, the Zulu entered a new era. From a small, often scorned community, they became a formidable tribe that neighbors had to reckon with. But Shaka had no intention of stopping there. The throne was merely the beginning. His chosen path was one of blood, fire, and conquest. To him, power was not something to hold, but to expand, to etch his name into history with greatness steeped in terror. From the moment Shaka declared himself king of the Zulu, the land would never know peace again. Those who once mocked him were now either dead or kneeling at his feet. History had turned to a new chapter, one of empire born from slaughter, and of a man who would become legend as one of Africa's most ruthless and brilliant kings. After seizing supreme power, Shaka did not stop at securing his throne. Almost immediately, he turned his gaze outward toward the vast lands stretching beyond the Zulu heartland. For him, being king was never enough. In his mind, the throne was only a beginning, a foundation upon which to build an empire, a colossal war machine capable of crushing all opposition. And he began that expansion with a series of campaigns, both ruthless and meticulously organized, giving rise to a historical phenomenon later known as the Mfikane, literally the crushing. To the tribes around him, Shaka was like a violent storm. He didn't simply march out, win battles, and return home. Every war he waged carried the mark of annihilation. Tribes that resisted were often wiped out entirely. The men were either killed or conscripted into the Zulu army, the women and children absorbed into Zulu society, while villages were burned to the ground to erase their very memory. This policy made Shaka not only a conqueror, but also in his own way a social architect. He wasn't just extending his domain, he was reshaping the human landscape to fit his vision. For those who chose submission, their fate was different. Shaka could be a shrewd diplomat when it suited him, offering favorable terms to tribal chiefs willing to surrender without bloodshed. Yet peace always came at a heavy price. They had to give up autonomy, hand over their young men as soldiers, and most importantly swear unconditional loyalty to Shaka. In this way, he rapidly expanded his forces, while weaving a network of power built on fear, coerced allegiance, and the grim understanding that defying the Zulu meant certain death. His conquests radiated outward in spirals, spreading from the Zulu core across southern Africa. Stories tell of villages that, upon hearing that Zulu warriors were approaching, dissolved on their own people, scattering, abandoning their homes and fields before Shaka's men even arrived. This terror itself became an invisible weapon no less effective than a spear. It shattered enemies from within, sowing chaos before the Zulu even had to strike. But the shadow side of this expansion was Mifecaine itself. For over a decade, these wars, migrations, and chain reactions of conflict claimed tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives. Small tribes vanished, completely erased from history. Fertile lands once teeming with people were left desolate, abandoned out of fear, or devastated by war. Entire groups were uprooted, forced to wander in search of refuge. While behind them, the Zulu kingdom grew ever stronger, rising as a military force no one dared to challenge. If the battlefield was where Shaka Zulu proved his genius, then politics was the stage where he turned himself into a living legend. To his people, Shaka was not just a leader, but the embodiment of strength, order, and fear. From small, scattered tribes, he forged a kingdom where every detail was controlled by an iron hand. And from that moment on, the name Shaka became forever linked with the image of the Napoleon of South Africa, a man both feared and admired. Shaka understood that true power did not rest solely on weapons and soldiers, but also on controlling the intangible information, loyalty, and fear. For this reason, he created one of the most sophisticated spy networks ever seen in the history of Southern Africa. Anyone loyal to Shaka, from warriors to common villagers, could serve as the king's eyes and ears. Every whispered conversation, every hint of dissatisfaction, even curses muttered in the dark, could find their way to Shaka. A mere suspicion of betrayal could mean sudden death. This shadowy grip on power forced the people into both awe and submission, for no one ever knew which familiar face might secretly be reporting to the king. In governing his people, Shaka imposed a harsh but effective system. Villages were bound by strict regulations issued from the royal court. The population was organized under appointed headmen, each directly accountable to the king, turning loyalty into a compulsory duty. Any act of disobedience, no matter how small, was treated as a direct challenge to Shaka's authority. Under his hand, the Zulu ceased to be a loose collection of tribes, and instead became a machine driven by discipline and fear. Yet what elevated Shaka into a symbol was not terror alone, but also reverence. He was the undefeated warrior, the one who could transform impoverished youths into formidable fighters. For young Zulu men, joining the empire was more than an obligation, it was an honor. To march beneath Shaka's banner was to take part in history, to become part of the storm that swept across the land. Tales of his military brilliance and superhuman strength spread far and wide, making him a near mythical figure even during his lifetime. Beyond warfare, Shaka established strict laws to shape society. He encouraged honesty, eradicated habits he saw as weakening the warrior spirit, and punished harshly those who defied Zulu standards. In a sense, Shaka raised discipline to the level of a religion, turning absolute obedience into the foundation of the empire's survival. This allowed him to hold power in a region plagued by instability, where tribes had once pledged loyalty only to their local chiefs. Outsiders might have looked at Shaka and seen a tyrant, but for the Zulu who lived under his reign, his rule inspired pride. They were no longer small, vulnerable communities waiting to be swallowed by stronger neighbors. They had become a powerful nation, a force with a voice in the region. Shaka had given them identity, unity, and the spirit of victors in an age of chaos. Shaka's political genius lay not only in his strict rule, but in his profound understanding of human psychology. He knew how to plant fear to maintain order, but also how to weave myth to cultivate loyalty. To his people, he was the king chosen by destiny, a man with supernatural strength. That devotion made the Zulu Empire stand not only on the edge of spears, but also on the unshakable belief that no one could defy Shaka's will. And so Shaka's radiance continued to spread, casting its glow over vast lands. But within that very light, shadows began to form, for absolute devotion and limitless power always carry a danger. When a king begins to believe himself immortal, he risks forgetting the boundaries of being human. Power, when left unchecked, inevitably turns into darkness that consumes the very one who wields it. For Shaka Zulu, once a brilliant leader and a master strategist, it slowly transformed him into the embodiment of unrestrained brutality. The death of his mother Nandi in 1827 marked the turning point that pushed his reign into madness. Shaka loved his mother with a devotion that is difficult to put into words. In the harsh Zulu society, where men often regarded maternal affection as weakness, he openly exalted Nandi as his source of spiritual strength. When she died, his grief was no longer ordinary mourning, but a whirlwind of vengeance unleashed upon his entire people. He decreed a mourning unlike anything ever seen before for 1 year. Not a single seed could be planted in the soil. No one was allowed to drink milk, the very staple of Zulu life, because it symbolized vitality. Men, women, and children were forced into hunger, drifting like shadows of the living dead. Pregnant women were executed for Shaka, declared, "No one has the right to bring forth new life, while the death of my mother still hangs over this sky." This was not just a command, but a law so merciless that it turned the entire kingdom into a living graveyard. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, were killed in the madness of those days of mourning. And the fury did not end with the funeral. Shaka began to distrust everyone. Any hint of dissatisfaction was met with swift execution. He even had loyal advisors put to death, simply because they did not cry loudly enough when Nandi's name was mentioned. In Shaka's eyes, the entire empire had to grieve as he did to share his agony completely or be branded as traitors. Power had turned his sorrow into the most terrifying weapon imaginable. From a reformer, Shaka became an absolute tyrant. He built a vast network of spies, stretching his reach into every village, turning whispers into death sentences. A careless word from a farmer could seal his fate. The Zulu people, once proud to be united under Shaka's banner, now lived in paralyzing fear, uncertain if they would survive another day. Historians have often compared Shaka to the great tyrants of history. Like Rome's Nero, he spiraled into madness after the loss of a loved one, turning personal tragedy into collective catastrophe. Like Ivan the Terrible of Russia, he slaughtered his closest allies out of baseless suspicion. But perhaps Shaka went even further, for he not only killed, he imposed suffering upon an entire society as if it were a sacred decree. Yet even in this darkness, Shaka's power still terrified his enemies. None dared challenge him outright, but within the heart of his people, seeds of resistance began to sprout. Chiefs and generals who had once sworn loyalty to him now whispered among themselves, could the Zulu kingdom survive under a king slowly losing his grip on reason? Shaka did not realize that the very storms he unleashed were paving the way for betrayal. When a kingdom is forced to choose between fear and survival, loyalty becomes nothing more than a fragile mask. And for Shaka, that mask would fall sooner than he ever expected. The end of Shaka Zulu did not come from the spears of his enemies, nor from some lingering illness, but from within the very house of power he had built with his own hands. History often follows a cruel law. The greatest figures are rarely undone by strangers, but by those closest to them, those who once shared their sweat, their blood, and their oaths. Shaka, with all his brutality and glory, was no exception. After the death of his mother, Nandi Shaka's mind grew increasingly unstable. The harsh and irrational decrees he imposed during the mourning period not only exhausted his people, but also shook the loyalty of his generals, his advisors, and even his kin. They had endured his iron hand for years, but now with his power at its peak, his madness and cruelty had crossed a threshold no one could bear. The mighty Zulu kingdom he had forged was drowning in fear, and within the very heart of his court, whispers of betrayal began to stir. Two of his half-brothers, Dingane and Malangana, who had long harbored envy and resentment, saw their moment arrive. They watched as Shaka drifted further from reality, issuing senseless orders commanding the killing of pregnant women, forcing the nation into famine as part of mourning rites. They understood that if they did not act, the people would remain trapped in the spiral of a king who had lost his grip on reason. In the shadows of conspiracy, Dingane and Malangana found an ally in Mbofa, once one of Shaka's most loyal attendants, now driven by terror to turn against the master he once served. The fateful day came in 1828, not on a blazing battlefield, not during a grand ceremony, but in an ordinary moment. Shaka, the man who had crushed dozens of tribes, the name that sent tremors across southern Africa, fell not to war but to the blades of betrayal. They approached him when he least expected it, when the fortress of power around him became his trap. Legend says Shaka did not fall at once. He fought back, glaring with rage and disbelief at his assassins. But no one came to his aid. No hand was raised to protect the king who had sown both triumph and terror. When the blade struck him, Shaka is said to have uttered his final words, part curse, part prophecy, that the Zulu kingdom would know no peace, that the betrayers themselves would be consumed by turmoil and destruction. His death sent shockwaves across the land. For many it was a release from a suffocating reign, an era where fear weighed heavier than breath. For others it was the collapse of a shield, the loss of a leader who, despite his brutality, was the only one strong enough to unite and defend the Zulu against hostile powers. The truth lies somewhere between those extremes. In the hazy space history often leaves behind when a man is both tyrant and hero. After Shaka's death, Dinganes seized the throne, but the legacy left behind was a double-edged sword. The Zulu Empire was a formidable force, yet also a red-hot iron ready to explode under the weight of resentments and divisions. Shaka was gone, but his presence lingered everywhere, in the regiments still drilling with the iron discipline he had forged in the villages, raised by his campaigns in the collective memory of thousands who had survived the devastation of the Mfikane. History does not easily forget a man like Shaka. He was a bringer of blood, a warrior consumed by the hunger for power, yet also a brilliant strategist, a visionary who transformed a small tribe into an empire that shook Africa. His death was not a simple end, but the beginning of a question that echoes through the centuries: can a great leader also be a tyrant? Can glory ever outweigh the suffering left in its wake? In the legends passed down through generations, Shaka is both hero and villain, symbol of strength and spectre of terror. Perhaps it is in that contradiction that his image has become immortal. A warrior fell, but his name endures in history's memory, an unquenchable flame burning both as light and as fire. There is a strange paradox in history. Those who spread terror are often the ones who leave the deepest mark. Shaka Zulu, hailed as a military genius and cursed as a bloodthirsty tyrant, is perhaps the clearest embodiment of that truth. When his spear fell with his final breath, what remained was not only an empire trembling in the aftermath of storms, but also an indelible scar etched into humanity's collective memory. To understand Shaka's legacy, we must confront both sides, the light of reform and strategy, and the darkness of relentless brutality. It is impossible to deny that Shaka reshaped the political landscape of southern Africa. From a patchwork of small tribes locked in petty disputes, he forged a unified war machine. Under his command, the Zulu people once scorned became a name that struck fear into enemies. His buffalo horns formation was more than a tactical invention. It was a symbol of his ability to turn fragmentation into strength. Centuries later, Western military scholars studying African history were astonished at the sharpness of his innovations, some even placing Shaka alongside the likes of Alexander the Great and Napoleon. But such glory came at a terrible cost. Shaka did not only unite, he also destroyed. The word miskane, the crushing, came to describe a nightmare that swept across southern Africa when thousands of villages were obliterated and countless people either died or were driven from their homelands. Weaker tribes were swallowed whole, while survivors were often forced into exile in distant lands. This massive displacement triggered chain reactions of conflict, sparking fresh wars, whose effects rippled well into the 19th century. For many communities, Shaka's name evokes not greatness, but blood and loss. And yet Shaka was not only a warrior, he was a builder. He created a centralized system of governance, enforced strict laws, and maintained a network of spies to control information. These measures gave birth to an organized Zulu state, unlike the loose tribal structures common in Africa at the time. Without Shaka, the name Zulu might never have traveled beyond a small village, let alone become an enduring symbol in world history. That is why, even when Western accounts portrayed him with savagery and cruelty, Shaka is still recognized as a leader of global stature. His legacy extends beyond politics and war, reaching into culture and memory. To this day, the Zulu people honor Shaka as a great ancestor, a source of national pride. Shaka's Day is still celebrated in South Africa, where thousands gather to pay tribute to the warrior king. In popular memory, he is both a hero who freed his people from weakness and a wrathful deity none dared oppose. His image became a double-edged symbol, one of strength but also a cautionary tale of brutality. The Western world, too, could not escape his shadow. 19th-century colonial historians painted him as the Attila of Africa, a destroyer of civilization. Yet modern scholars often view him differently, as a symbol of indigenous strength resisting colonial disdain. Without Shaka, European expansion into southern Africa might have met far less resistance, and the Zulu people could have been erased much earlier. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Shaka's legacy is its contradictions. He left behind a powerful Zulu Empire, but also planted the seeds of instability that would last for centuries. He inspired national pride, but also a memory drenched in blood. He was a rejected son who rose through sheer will to embody power itself, only to be betrayed and brought down by those closest to him. His story resembles a Greek tragedy where hero and tyrant, light and darkness, coexist in a single fate. Today, looking back, we see Shaka Zulu as both a product of his age and someone who transcended it. In a world where survival was bound to violence, he elevated the art of war to unprecedented heights. Yet by pushing too far, turning power into frenzy, his downfall became inevitable. His most enduring legacy may be a reminder: power is never pure. It can build a nation, but it can also destroy millions of lives. Shaka Zulu is long dead, but the name Shaka still echoes. It resounds in the drums of Zulu festivals, in the pages of military history, and in the conflicting tales passed down by word of mouth. Part of humanity admires him, another part fears him, but no one can ignore him. And that is his greatest legacy, an immortal presence in history, where light and darkness are no longer separate, but woven together into a tragic, eternal tapestry of power and humanity.